Hello, I'm Professor PhD Antonio Sandu from Ștefan cel Mare University of Suceava, and I'm also director of Lumen Publishing House and Lumen Conference Center from Iași, Romania, and we will discuss about ethical approach on scientific papers, some guidelines for PhD students and young researchers especially, and for those who want to publish scientific paper in Lumen's journal or in any other journal or books. Please be with us on Editura Lumen YouTube channel for other presentations on the ethical standards in publication and research, for bioethics and other research topics, and also from other papers. Components of the research projects. One of these components are literature review. Presenting the scientific literature, the so-called literature review, has the purpose of configuring the scientific context in which the whole research falls. Within the presentation, it must be highlighted the area in which knowledge needs to be deepened, presented information on the way in which the issue approach is being regarded in the scientific literature. A good literature review doesn't exhaustively approach the topic of the research, but formulated a scientific literature regarding reading grid. This is selected and interpreted in correlation with the purpose of the current research or paper in order to later analyze whether the empirical results or theoretical proposal are consistent with the literature, or purpose or change of the paradigm contrasting with the other previous published results, and so on. Levy and Elias shows that a literature review should use the information in the literature to justify a particular approach to the research topic or to the paper, how to select the methodology, the areas where novelties are brought, and so on. A good literature review builds the framework for a new scientific achievements in the field. Levy and Elias also presents the following feature of the literature review: the methodological analysis, the selection of and the synthesis of the quality literature in the field, the construction of a solid analysis based leading to the achievement of the research objective, and the clear demonstration of the place of the current research in the totality of the research in the field. The literature review is a process of gradual application of methodical steps of collecting, analyzing, understanding, evaluating the application, analyzing, and synthesis of convergent quality literature for the purpose of research, without being exhaustive, for the purpose of identify the place of research in the whole of the knowledge and the context of the knowledge in the field, and the possibility of their own contribution in the development of knowledge. But the literature research is a literature review is a research, theoretical research in itself, but is not research methodology for the paper, for your project. When you do literature research, you just make documentation on other research, on the research already being published, but it is not. It could be not mentioned as your own research methodology, but you should do this in a methodic way. So methodological part of the research of the paper is one part. It includes the methods to acquiring data, and literature research is another part of your paper that presents the state of art in your area where the paper is intended to be written. It is especially important to include in the literature review the papers underlying the research proposal or the research topics of the article. In the case that project develop a theory, or article a theoretical own point of view, different from other researches previously published, those papers should be presented in the literature review, even if you do not agree with them, and accordingly credited with citation. The way in which the article mentioned influence that research should be also mentioned. A research can be placed further or in opposition to one of several of the results published in the scientific literature papers. In the case of theoretical articles, which critically refers to the scientific literature, the stage of literature review will be followed by wide theoretical analysis, including the papers cited in the literature review, which can be revised, criticized, contradict, or, on the contrary, used in own argumentation. The stage of literature review is itself a critical analysis, because by the very synthesis we are making, we express our theoretical position toward the consulted work. A good literature review should refer both to the literature that supports own point of view and to the one to contradict it. In the stage of proposing a research project, its own point of view, taking into account the prerequisite of research and methodological reserve to them, should be emphasized and expressed. A methodological reserve is methodically expressed, but not again, not part of our own research and data research, let's say, but is our own theoretical documentation and theoretical express our idea. If their own opinion can be validated in the research, they should be validated as research assumptions. From an ethical point of view, the lack of transparency with regard to assumptions that influence research, either through the particular design of the research or by the prior selection of favorable results, which leads to falsification of the results, can be interpreted as an attempt to fraud in research results. This may be the case for some research on gay community, for example, starting from the implicit or but not explicitly assumed premise that the development of this community and the rights granted to this minority are harmful to the society. If this kind of paper still exists in the literature. The research will, as assumption that it will attempt to demonstrate, base a series of considerations on the community which will not treat with axiological impartiality and neutrality. The advice of many research in social studies starts from the intention of highlighting the supremacy of one position through the pseudo-surveys lacking axiological neutrality. Although apparently such research can follow the rules of good research, it is in itself unethical, unbiased, or discriminatory, biased and discriminatory. Proper ethical research should analyze the phenomena from all points of view, including those that contradict the research hypothesis. A particular mention must be made of a series of constructional research which assumes the neutrality and objectivity cannot be absolute, and that the views of research can influence the result, in which case these views and how could they influence the results and clearly expressed in the research projects and or in the paper that in the publication that will result from your research. So if you cannot present all your assumption or all your presumptions, at least you should mention that some of them could influence your results and your interpretation of the data. The same ideological partisanship can influence not only the researcher but also the evaluator of the project or peer reviewers who may be inclined to accept a project or paper that is convergent with its own choice and to reject another that seems to contradict him. In our opinion, the ideological neutral attitude should be maintained by including all predictable direction in the project or in the paper which significant results may appear, such as the methodological opinion for narrative research, for example, should be completed with the semi-structured interviews in case that first ones will not generate the saturation of the model that will include all constitutive elements of the phenomena, at least how they are predictable for the researchers, including following the scientific literature. The literature review will not widely present the existing data in the literature, but will only make mentions on taking them into consideration, when developing the research. The way the proponents foresee that the position expressed in the literature will influence the research approach as well as the position of the researcher or research team towards the researched subjects or topics. It is advisable to present a more detailed theory when the whole research or fragments thereof are based on the particular theory or methodology, and it has a certain degree of novelty for readers or for evaluators who, although familiar with the research area, may not know all the particular theories in the subdomains. This is particularly true in trans and interdisciplinary research. It is possible that the current theory in a certain area of research may require explanations when used as a theoretical support in an area where it has not been or has not been poorly developed. By reading the literature review, a medium-level reader of the field must be able to understand the project or the paper without having to resort to the additional reading which he most probably would not. Levy and Elias assert that it is preferable to review the literature focusing on key concepts and exploring their relevance and the recessions, the meanings in which key concepts are used, rather than focusing on the chronological aspect of or the contribution of one or small groups of authors. The scientific literature should be interrogated about its relevance to the research team. The presence of an article in a journal in the main flow log should not be considered as a guarantee of its quality, nor does the occurrence of an article in a journal outside the main circuit automatically classify it as less scientifically, but some journals are more credible than other journals, so credibility affect the reception of the paper. However, an article in the mainstream of or indexed journal in database is more likely to influence the advance of science in a particular field. The selection of the literature to be quoted should take into account not only the adequacy and the relevancy to the theme, but also the relative validity and the veracity of the research results. Randolph draw the attention that the failure in writing the literature review usually brings the failure of the entire research. Booth and Bale show that a good literature review is based on a conceptualization of the relevant literature, and that this conceptualization increases the chance of the evaluator to appreciate the value of a research project. The quoted author points out that a good literature review can itself be a publishable work. Other purposes for which the literature review is carried out may be the creation of new research lines, the avoidance of approaches that will be doomed to failure, the theoretical support for the data obtained, the methodological clarification, and so on. Cooper carries out a taxonomy of literature review which he classifies according to the following criteria. Focusing. Following this criteria, the literature review aims at the synthesis of the results in a field, the methodological synthesis, the theoretical approach, and the practical application of research in a field. After purpose, aims to theoretically integrate through generalization to develop certain linguistic compatibility between different fields of science, theoretically compatibility, critical approach in a field, and so on. Approach perspective. A literature review can be elaborated as a neutral presentation or presenting own position toward the citing works. Covering the literature in the field, exhaustive, especially in treatises and the university courses, selectively exhaustive in theoretical papers and literature review published as such, or focus on topics and key concepts. From the point of view of organizing the review, it can be approached historically, conceptually, or methodologically. From the perspective of the audience, a reviewer can address an academic audience, strictly specialized and narrow, a general academic audience, an audience generally constituted of practitioners and decision makers in the field, or a general audience. If in the case of a thesis or dissertation, the literature review spans a whole chapter in a journal article, the dimensions are much smaller, only the most significant references will be commented, usually using the paraphrase, avoiding quoting the source entirely, except when the fragment is considerable commented in the text and is part of your text. It's analyzed of this quotation. From the perspective of evaluation of the research project, it is analyzed how the researcher is familiar with and is aware of the researcher carried out in the respective field. A good position toward the literature allows avoiding the repetition of already existing and documented research in the literature, but also the carrying out of some early research. The analysis of the scientific literature is part of a research proposal or published article, which shows the correct positioning of the research compared to the rest of scientific literature in the field. Rationality of research. From the point of view of the rationality of the research, it is considered the logic that links the hypothesis or research questions with the specific of the research plan. The selection of the subjects and the research material, it is considered the number of persons the research will be conducted on, how will the access of the investigating population will occur, and how. Methods of data collection. Here we consider the observational or experimental nature of the work, the working protocols, data collection, control, what data will be collected and where and how. The way of interpreting the data, this should be logical and clearly stated in the research proposal or in the paper. More precisely, it should highlight the quantitative, statistical, or qualitative, inductive, or deductive data analysis method. Ethical perspective and on socio-human research methodology. The methodology chapter describes the main methods and techniques used to achieve the results. Study design and collection are presented. The methodological chapter is mainly used in empirical research based on direct field investigation. For the fields of theoretical research, including philosophy, law, literature, the argumentative approach, it is even the methodological dimension of the research, and therefore some publications call for methodological references in articles with a theoretical character, even if they will not necessarily be included in a chapter of methodology. The methodology used in theoretical research can be critical analysis, comparative methods, case study, hermeneutical method, phenomenological methodology, semiotics method, historical methodology, discourse analysis, and so on. The empirical methodologies used in the case of articles that value the field research can be, for example, experiments, quantitative research through survey, qualitative research through interview, focus group, and so on. As far as the methodological dimension of research is concerned, it includes a series of implications of ethical nature regarding its scientific nature and the potential risk for participants. In the experimental design, the limitations, the way of obtaining informed consent from participants, the risk and the benefits, and so on, will be expressly presented. Also, in the methodology, when the articles are based on collecting and interpreting field data, will be considered the way of sampling and its validity, the data representativity for the research population, the establishment of the experimental group if exists such, we're working with the experimental method. In the case of qualitative content analysis, aside from the brief presentation of interpretation method, presenting the limitation of the research is considered correlated with the ontological and epistemological approach to which the research is subsumed. This is about the realistic, positivist, constructivist, and so on paradigm. In the methodological part, it can be discussed about the validity of the instrument and their translation and the permission to use the instrument. The practical way of applying the field instruments is also recommended to be included in methodology. When the research of human subjects, are especially on vulnerable group, is being discussed, the article should discuss the way of obtaining the informed consent and the ethical perspective considering elaborating the research. The most important role of the part of methodology is that it allows to duplicate the results in future research or deepening them and obtain different local results. This is why when particular data collection or interpretation techniques that are less known to the usual readers of the journal are being used, they should be explained in detail. The concrete and explicit elaboration of research design that would include methods and techniques of collecting data, the instrument used to data collecting phases, sampling, and including participants in the research, allows to estimate the possibility of reaching the objective of the research, feasibility and credibility of the research, limitation of risk of presenting unrealistic data, the level of involvement of human subjects, the risk that the participation in the research may involve for the subjects the existence or inexistence of alternative strategy of data collection, and so on. Not respecting the research projects when this affects the credibility and validity of the results and making the participants face undue risk is an unethical behavior in research. For example, the lack of reflection on the representative sample in a sociological quantitative research makes it invalid, and the presentation of the data as being complete can in a way be considered as falsifying the research results. The development of chaotic research that doesn't respect or is not based on a research project does not have a scientific nature. The data obtaining not being considered valid, thus the research is unethical from the perspective of trust of the scientific community. Ethics perspective on methods of data analysis. There are considered, for example, mathematical or statistical instruments used for analyzing data and extracting meaning in data analysis, which consider correlating with research hypotheses and whether they are supported by data or not. The methods of data analysis are not considered research methods. They are simply methods of analysis of the data. So we use methodology in analyzing literature research. It's a separate chapter of the paper. We're using methodology to collect data, and we're using methodology to analyzing data. I stress this distinction because I receive many papers that say we use a methodology of theoretical analysis and statistical analysis and so on, and this was mentioned as research methodology or data collection methodology. So it's a different part of the paper and should mention it in different separate part of the research. The more exposure of qualitative or quantitative data is not sufficient in lack of correlation with other data or different or similar or contradictory that data are in the scientific literature. So we come back to our literature review and compare the data we obtain with those indicated in the literature. The data interpretation should be done in terms of answering the research questions and validating or invalidating the hypothesis. When the research is presented by publishing or presenting into conferences, it is necessary to present the meaning of data in the chapter of results other than those consistent with the objective of research that either contradict the hypothesis or open the way for future research not foreseen initially. The scientific literature recommends avoiding the presentation of the same data under several forms, graphic, table, narration, and so on. But sometimes it is necessary to present the data in the different approach for best clarity of the paper. In this case, only in the large textbooks or books it is allowed to present the same data in many ways. But in the paper, in scientific article that have to be limited in space, you can present data in most expressive way. The presentation of data is done from particular to general, emphasizing on the meaning of data and not number obtained, which will, however, not be omitted where the research has led to numerical data. In the case of statistics, it is necessary to specify the existing correlations, but also the direct meaning of the results. The results of the test of meaning and validity should also be present. Statistics have the purpose of serving the analysis, not substituting it. In the case of mixed study, the quantitative and qualitative results will be presented separately, insisting on the way in which they support each other. The qualitative interpretation of data obtained through interviews, focus groups, press analysis, and so on will contain significant expression from the original data material, followed closely by the interpretation, categorization, theoretical and methodological construction, and so on. In the case of qualitative data, they must go through process of inductive deductive selection, and the reader having access to a series of examples of intermediary procedures and raw data only where the editorial space allowed it. An ethical issue related to the presentation of data is that of multiple presentation. Especially in the wide range social research, the data chosen exceed the size of an article, and as such, the data should be published in a number of articles that should the data according to the size of the research. Excessive fragmentation of data is considered an unethical practice, since artificially increases the number of publication of research team members and implicitly their academic credit. When it is necessary to repeat a part of the data in several articles, either for a secondary analysis of them or to make intelligible other data to which the data is centered, the previously published data is quoted appropriately, either by an acknowledgement or simply by mentioning the previous article in the literature reviews chapter. It is necessary to avoid repeated publication of the same content in the same specific context. Repeat publication is legitimate when it is done in different scientific contexts, for example in different language publication, in different forms of publication, such as in the proceeding of a conference followed by the extensive publication in a journal article, the resumption for school purposes in textbooks of the results of research and so on. In either of these situations, it is necessary to quote the first source and possibly to include an acknowledgement certifying that it is a work that has been republished with the consent of the holder of the publishing rights. Another element considered for research proposal is how the results will be disseminated: journal article, monographs, CDs, website, conference presentation, a combination of the above or other possibility. The social constructionist paradigm on social research discusses even the reunification of the idea of validity of research, especially in the qualitative one, and its replacement with the verisimilitude, credibility, and so on. Validity is a construct belonging to the objective realistic science paradigm that postulates the cognoscibility of the world and the net distinction between the researched reality and the researcher. In the practice of social research, such as this distinction is not always operative. The very fact that a community is questions about a certain social phenomena is elemental that force it to reflect upon it and implicitly modifies the interpretation of the social phenomena. Social research changed the social reality throughout the investigative approach. As such, ethical reflection on the impact that certain social research, such as those in the field of policy research, for example, social work, microsociology of groups and organization, and so on, has on the population under investigation is necessary. At least there is a need for a response on non-maleficent, non-discrimination, social justice, and respect for the autonomy and dignity of the members of the investigated community, not just the direct participants in research of those researchers. A research intervention cannot be axiologically irrelevant, and ultimately there is an ideological, theoretical foundation behind the research project. On the other hand, the subjectivity of the researcher inevitably puts its marks on the process of designing research, analyzing data, especially qualitative ones, where the hermeneutical freedom the researcher has is significant. This influence of the researcher's subjectivity must be present in a subchapter of the discussion and limits, which should exist both in the research proposal and in the publications resulting from the research project. Another possible violation of objectivity is the excessive predilection from research methods that is being taken by the researcher despite its obvious limitation of providing the full or partial results required to achieve the purpose of its research. The predilection for a certain qualitative methodology, for example, when it fails to capture all the faces of a social phenomena, can generate a lack of objectivity of research. The researcher tends to censure the part of the social phenomena that could not be captured precisely by expressing this impossibility as a limit of research. Correct expression of research boundary is a tool for exercising the fairness and honesty of the researcher and should aim at the real limitation given by the objective and subjective research and limitation of the methodology itself, but these limits should be objectively overcome, including by calling on other methodologies of a quantitative nature, in our case, that would make it possible to capture other aspects of the studied phenomena. Thank you for listening to me, and also I invite you to be with us in Editura Lumen channel on YouTube, and listen to another presentation on ethical aspects, on applied ethics, bioethics, research methodology, and so on. So please be with us and have a wonderful day.